Welcome to a lecture on Immanuel Kant's Groundwork for the Metaphysics of Morals, 1785. Just want to start with a date, obviously constitutionally significant. In the 4-year period from 1776 and the Declaration of Independence and Thomas Paine's Common Sense and the moral principles embedded in those documents. In the 15-year period from 1776 to the ratification of the Bill of Rights Constitution, that is the Constitution with the first 10 amendments in 1791, we have this groundwork, moral philosophy from Immanuel Kant. So, we have John Locke's Second Treatise of Government in 1690 that percolated into the American Revolution, the French Revolution, and then we have Immanuel Kant's groundwork for the Metaphysics of Morals in 1785 at the boiling point of the formation of American democracy. And so these two individuals, and you could argue there are many more we could study, but Locke and Kantian moral philosophy really provide enough for us to view the Constitution through a moral lens. And so when we're looking and using Lockean natural law philosophy and Kantian natural law philosophy, we are looking at the Constitution morally. We are applying moralism to constitutional interpretation. So let's begin with the real conflict between Kant and John Stuart Mill. So, in most of the cases that we're going to study, none of the cases that we study that come before the Supreme Court that split the court 5-4 are easy decisions, and the arguments can be made both ways. And so, but usually the arguments split down between utilitarian, consequential perspective that Mill provided with us with utilitarianism, the idea that the greatest good for the greatest number determines the moral worth of an act or a law, and the moral principlist view from Kant and from Locke that argue that the moral worth of an action or a law cannot gain any justification from the ends, positive or negative, that it achieves, but in the idea or the principle in the act itself. So, moral principlism versus utilitarianism really runs the divide for affirmative action, right? The benefits of educational diversity that stem from a racially, ethnically diverse classroom. That's a positive benefit to the violation of the principle that one should not make adverse or positive judgments based upon an arbitrary attribute, one's skin color. Well, Kant finds man as a moral, reasoning, autonomous agent. And this obliges all men to respect a man's life, liberty, and property. And so Kant very significantly distinguishes his philosophy from Locke in the sense that he says, Locke says, look, we must respect life, liberty, and property of others because man is not of his own nature, he's of God, God-given reason. Locke says, look, Kant comes around and says, look, yeah, Locke, sure, you can locate the origins of reason and the origins of autonomy and independence in God. That's fine, but for Kant, it was enough that man is rational, man has access to reason, man is free, independent, and an autonomous moral agent that can decide being right and wrong, and therefore we are obliged to respect his life, his liberty, and property. Okay. Let's move on to the next slide. Let me give you an example of our duty to principle, our idea as being autonomous moral agents, and try to universalize or categorize or to apply a principle categorically. Let's take lying, for example, and he uses this in his treatise here, The Metaphysics of Morals. He says, let's say that people contingently say it's okay to lie, that I'm going to lie on my bank loan, and I'm really not going to have the means to pay it back. Well, what would happen? What is the principle there? The principle is that you can lie, you can misrepresent the truth to if it benefits your own self-interest. Well, if we universalize that, if we apply that categorically to all situations, then no loans mean anything. There's no trust. There's no faith. The interactions between human beings become meaningless, or they become fearful because no one can take anybody at their word. So therefore, when we categorize it, when we universalize it, we realize it does not hold up to the categorical imperative. Well, there are three really, if you remember anything about Immanuel Kant's philosophy, remember the three concepts of duty, autonomy, in the categorical imperative. And so he says, look, he likes to set up these dialectics. We, as rational, free, autonomous beings. Okay, what did he say? Well, an act is not moral based upon an actual or intended results, but by the underlying principle on which it is based. The idea, the principle in the action, not the results of the action. So he says, the moral worth of an action has its moral worth not in the objective to be reached by that action, but on the principle of volition in accordance with which the principle is done. The moral worth of an action depends neither on the result of the expected action, nor on any principle of the action that has to borrow its motive from the expected result. Right? The means need to be moral in and of themselves. For these results, one's own pleasurable condition, or even the promotion of happiness of others, which are good things, wonderful things, right? As Mill has argued in utilitarian philosophy, could be brought about by any other causes. The idea, and not the expected result, is the determining ground of the will. The preeminent will is already present in the person who acts in accordance with this idea. We need not wait the result of the action in order to find it. Okay, so there can be wonderful things that can happen from following a principle. There also can be negative things that can happen from following a policy. And often they can be negative things that happens to oneself, right? Voting against one's own self-interest is a higher morally worthy act than voting out of one's own self-interest. If you believe in a cause and you vote for that politician who believes in a cause, and supporting that politician will actually cost you more, right, in taxes, or require you to pay more on a certain levy, still has higher moral worth than voting out of one's own self-interest. So, in summary, we should judge the morality of an action or the constitutionality of a law based upon the principle implicit in that action or law, and not on the deleterious or meritorious results of the action. It's the morality of the means, and not the morality of the ends achieved by the means. Important concepts. All right, well, what does he mean by duty? Duty is the obligation to follow reason principles and not personal predilections. Moral laws are a priori. That means a priori means before the beginning of time, obligations. They were before the world existed. Everyone, he writes, must admit that if a law is to have moral force, to be the basis of an obligation, which what laws are, they oblige us to follow them, the law must carry with it absolute necessity, that therefore the basis of obligation must not be sought in the nature of man or in the particular contingent circumstances in the world in which he is placed, but they must be based on a priori principles, ideas, reasons, simply in the concept of pure reason. Really important concept, right? That pure reason, our ability to, as rational autonomous beings, should allow us to arrive at the a priori principles that inform a law and make it obligatory. Okay, for example, drunk driving, something I'm sure your parents have talked to you about, right? You cannot get in your car after having drinks because you'll be a threat to your own life, which you have an obligation to respect your life, and you'll be a threat to the lives of others, and you have an obligation to respect the lives of others. And Locke, in the second treatise, told us why we have that respect for our own life and for the lives of others. And Kant says we do as well because we are autonomous, independent, rational beings. Okay. A good will is manifested when we act out of duty rather than inclination to our personal predilections. Kant writes, everyone has a duty to preserve one's life, and everyone has a direct inclination to do it. The fearful care people take for their lives has no intrinsic worth, no moral merit, if it is done out of duty. But if one longs for death and still preserves life without loving it, not out of inclination, but out of duty, out of respect for life itself, as something to be respected, then that person's maxim has moral worth. High moral worth. Okay. So this is a difficult concept. Let me just pause on this. So the highest moral worth of an action is achieved by following a principle, a duty, even when following that principle affects one negatively. Okay. An example here is to preserve one's life even when one feels the desire not to live. All right, let's take a look at autonomy, right? How are we autonomous? Well, autonomy he defines as freedom to choose acts out of duty, not out of predilections, right? We are free to choose between right and wrong. A heteronymous action, he argues, is doing something for the sake of the ends given outside of us, not controlled by us, like instinct, like how our desires, our tastes are shaped by society. That is heteronymous action. An autonomous action is doing something for the principle in the act, for the idea in the action, as an end in and of itself, regardless of the positive benefits it brings about. Rational humans have the capacity for autonomous action and therefore moral action. Okay? And this is his basis for why we need to respect our own lives and respect the lives of others. Our autonomy, our reason, leads to us being moral, rational beings. Okay? We are not animals. We are not a victim to our instincts of mating and eating and serving our duties that are forced upon us from forces that we cannot control. Okay, let's have a look at that. So here's a really famous idea that Kant gave us, and the world is a better place because he did give it to us, and that is the idea of the categorical imperative versus the contingent situation. So the principle of an act needs to be applied universally. So act only on that maxim he wrote, through which, maximum being a principle, maximum being an idea, through which you can at the same time will that it should become universal law. So the idea, the principle in your action and in your law should be able to apply to all people in all places. Since every practical law represents a possible action as good, if the action is good only as a means to something else, and the imperative is hypothetical or contingent. If it's conceived as a good in itself, and consequently as being necessarily the principle of will which of itself conforms to reason, then it is categorical, it is universal. Okay? So, littering, for example. If you took the idea of being able to throw your trash out the window, and this principle of being able to throw your trash out the window when you want, applied to all people, then you'd have the world as a cesspool of trash, right? And so the maximum of littering cannot be willed as a universal law. It doesn't hold up. Think about that for a second. Think about some of the things that you do, some of the things that you say. Would you want all people to do them? He's given us a great way of thinking about the world. All right. So, one of his great quotes is about the morality of the means. If you remember anything beyond duty, autonomy, and the categorical imperative, remember that Kant is all about, and Locke is all about the morality of the means, the principle of the means of an act. A good will is good not because of what it performs or what it affects, not by its aptness for the attainment of some proposed end, but simply by virtue of the volition. That is, good in and of itself, without having to borrow the justification from the end. Okay, all right. Important stuff. How we can apply it. This is where it gets interesting, right? Can you will the maxim or principle upon which your action is based become universal? One of my favorite quotes is this one right here, where he says, "Well, moral worth is the issue. What counts is not the actions which one sees, not the actual performing of an act, but the inner principles which one does not see." So when we think of an action, we think of a law, and we're trying to determine the constitutionality of the law, and we're looking at the Constitution through a moral lens. Let's take affirmative action, for example. We're not really concerned with what affirmative action actually looks like in the reality on campus, although that's a valid way of thinking, right? That's a utilitarian, consequential way of thinking about it. But as a moralist, we're concerned, what's the idea? What's the idea of affirmative action? Okay? And what is the inner principle that it rests upon? Okay? All right, well, here's another example. So can one, we already did this in an earlier slide, but can one make a false promise to repay a loan that one cannot repay? I want you to pause, and I want you to try to answer these two questions. One, what is the principle of the action of the false promise? What is the idea in the action of lying on a loan? And second, what happens to the meaning of promises when you universalize the maxim? So in your Google Journal, I want you to try to answer those two questions under the title, Immanuel Kant, Groundwork for Metaphysics of Morals. Well, welcome back. I mean, hopefully your answers have something along the lines of, lying for one's own self-interest is acceptable, right? That's a principle in the idea of lying on a loan. What happens when you universalize that? The loans are trustworthy, the economy fails. It cannot be universalized. It cannot be applied to all people, right? As he says in the categorical imperative, act only on that maxim that you could at the same time will that maxim become universal law. Okay. All right. Let's try it on another case. Some of you are familiar with this case, that when we went into Afghanistan, we had a chance to locate Osama bin Laden in the hills of Tora Bora, and we sent in 3 naval SEALs to assassinate bin Laden. This is the failed attempt to do so. They encountered 150 heavily armed Taliban in the area, and so they were in there at night, and they woke up to 2 unarmed, really goat herders, and 1 14-year-old boy and 100 goats, okay, with their bells around them, and they just didn't know what to do. They looked at each other. They've got these 3 guys, so they've got the 2 older men, goat herders, and the young boy, and they bring them together, and they vote. What are we going to do? Well, we got to take these guys out. 2 of them, 2 out of 3 says. They're a threat to our personal safety. If we let them go, they're going to let the Taliban down there know that we're here, and 1 votes to let them go. I'm sorry. It went the other way. 2 voted to let them go, and 1 voted to take them out to preserve their own lives. Well, they let them go, and 1 hour later, 80 armed Taliban fighters surround them. 2 of the 3 Navy SEAls are killed. 1 survives and actually writes a book about it. And then a Navy rescue helicopter comes in to take that man out, and it gets shot down, and all 16 men on board are killed. So horrible, horrendous consequences here, right, for life. But what's the principle involved? Should the survivor, who voted to let them go, have voted to kill the 2 goat herders and the boy? It's an interesting fact that he was the one who voted to let them go. And he's the one who survived. So press pause and add to your journal. What's the principle or maxim of the action of killing the herders? Of taking out the innocent life of 3 individuals and 2 men and 1 innocent boy who has nothing to do with the United States war with Afghanistan. What's the principle there? What's the maxim? What's the idea there of taking them out? And what happens to the meaning of innocent life when you universalize the maxim? So press pause and answer those in your journal. Well, welcome back. Hopefully your answer is something along the lines of that, the principle in the action of taking all 3 men out is that innocent life is expendable for personal safety. That innocent life can be taken out if one's personal safety is involved. Well, if you universalize that, then all innocent life is vulnerable to the protection of public safety, and we no longer have innocent life as something that should be valued and sacred and protected. All right. Similar case, a famous case that many of you will encounter in law school if you go to law school, and that is the Queen versus Dudley and Stevens in 1884. This is a wild case. So 3 sailors in an open boat are cast off a ship 1,600 miles from the Cape of Good Hope. Their ship drowns. They're the only lifeboat that's made it out. They've gone 7 days without food, 5 days without water. And Dudley and Stevens and Richard Parker. So Dudley and Stevens are older men, and Richard Parker's this young boy working on the ship. They know they're all starving. They know if they don't do something that they're all going to die. So they propose to draw straws to see who should die first and serve as sustenance for the others. Well, they actually wind up not doing that because as they are debating doing this and debating drawing the stars, then Dudley and Stevens make the argument they should live because they have their own families and they're older, but no straws are actually done. And in the process of doing this, in the day or two that go by, Parker's condition gets far worse. He lays emaciated and unmoving in the bottom of the boat. And Dudley and Stevens decide to take him out. They kill him. They proceed to eat him for 4 days. And on the 4th day they see a sail. And they are rescued. And they are brought back to England. And the story is told. And they are brought to court. And the court has basically said the case was trying them for cannibalism, for the wrong of eating innocent life. Should Dudley and Stevens have let Richard Parker live, or were they justified in killing them? Obviously, positive result here, right? Same idea, but different result. Positive result, they lived. These men with families, these fathers with children lived, in taking out the innocent life of Richard Parker, who was on his way out, you could argue, soon. So, press pause and add to your journal, what's the principle or maxim of the action of killing Parker, the 17-year-old boy, and what happens to the meaning of innocent life when you universalize the action? All right, well, welcome back. Hopefully your first answer has something along the lines like the last one, that innocent life is expendable to save the lives of others. That's the principle. That's the idea in that action. Right? We're not concerned with the actual action of killing him. What's the idea in there? That innocent life is expendable if it preserves the lives of others. Well, that's problematic. Why? Because when you universalize that idea, that maxim, we realize that there is a loss of the duty to protect innocent life. Okay. Man, Kant wrote, and here is the true conflict. As a rational being exists as an end in himself and not merely as arbitrary use for this or that will. Right? Man as rational, autonomous, independent, moral, reasoning agent is a good in and of itself and cannot be used for positive ends. His life cannot be taken for positive ends. Well, Mill would say, look, hey, utility, right? The greatest good for the greatest number is the directive of human conduct, is the ultimate judge of moral worth of an action. So, Kant would say, nope, we have a duty to principle. We must follow that principle even when it acts against our own self-interest, as it did in the Navy SEAL case, and as it would have had they let Parker live in the lifeboat case. And then Mill would say, look, we have a duty to utility, so yes, they should have taken out those goat herders because they would have saved many innocent lives, and they would have agreed with Dudley and Stevens that they should have taken out Parker because it saved more lives than just Parker's life. All right, more lives than just... All right. So, can you will that the maxim or principle upon which your action is based become universal? Great thing to remember when you're thinking about the moral worth of your action. Remember, you're looking for inner principles. Okay, so here are some fun ones, right? Can you enslave short people because their free labor improves the economy? Can you discriminate based upon arbitrary attributes like skin color to create better class discussions and educational diversity? Can you take innocent life to avoid financial burden of child rearing or the psychological burden of child rearing? Can a terminally ill patient end his or her life to avoid pain and suffering? The death with dignity. So here we have slavery, right? Affirmative action, abortion, and right to die with dignity issues. Let's try to locate some principles. I want you to press pause when I read these, and I want you to identify the inner principles adversely affected in the acts below. Slavery for short people improves the economy. What's the inner principle there? Discriminations based on race can create better class discussion. What's the idea in that action? What's the principle there? Abortion allows mothers to avoid financial burden of child rearing. What's the idea in the abortion and the taking of the fetus? Terminally ill patients can end their lives to avoid pain and suffering. Okay? What's the principle? What's the maxim upon that affects innocent life here? Well, press pause, fill that out in your journal, look at the next slide. Here are the moral principles adversely affected, right? Personal liberty cannot be contingent upon morally insignificant attributes, right? Notice that improves the economy as a utilitarian way of justifying enslaving short people, right? Right? Short people is a morally insignificant attribute. It's something you're powerless to affect, and you cannot make positive or adverse judgments based upon it. Well, same thing down in here. One's arbitrary attribute cannot make one less morally deserving of equal treatment, right? Discriminations based on race create better class discussions, right? Saying, keeping out certain white kids from a certain university and bringing in underrepresented minorities to create better class discussions, right, is discrimination based on a morally insignificant attribute, right? Notice, class discussion is a utilitarian way of justifying discriminations, right? But it's the principle, right, that we cannot violate. And so for Kantian, for moralists, for Lockean way of thinking, the morally insignificant attributes cannot be the basis for discrimination. All right. Well, abortion allows mothers to avoid financial burden of child rearing. Well, the principle here is life is intrinsically worthy if you grant that the fetus is a life, worthy of preservation, of dignity, of respect. Why? Locke would say because life is God-given. It's not ours to play with willy-nilly. Kant would say it's not ours to play with willy-nilly, to dispose of, because we are rational, autonomous, independent beings. We must respect that in others. We must respect it in ourselves. Well, same thing goes for why moralists find abortion to be morally unjustified. They also find assisted suicide to be morally unjustified because life is intrinsically worthy of preservation, dignity, and respect. Man as a rational being exists as an end in itself and not merely as arbitrary use for this or that will. Right? Terminally ill patients are going to die, can end their lives through state of Washington, state of Oregon, to avoid pain and suffering, right? Obviously, a great positive consequence, no pain, no suffering, right, to justify the act of taking an innocent life, right? But moral philosophers and moral approaches to the Constitution say you cannot do that. The end cannot be the justification for the morality of the means. It's the means in itself that must be moral. Last quote on this long lecture, thank you for your attention, is that the ancillary ends, the after effect ends, cannot justify the means. Okay? One cannot speak of doing a categorical wrong for the sake of a higher good. A great professor I had at Amherst argued this. We are saying that an act is wrong when it is based on a maxim which is logically inconsistent with the ideas of moral itself. The act is judged to be right or wrong on the basis of a logical connection to the idea of morals, of reason, judgment, regardless of whether or not any ancillary, after the fact effects happen to produce are desirable. That is not to say that the ancillary ends are not desirable. They are, right? Decrease pain, decrease suffering, right? Decrease psychological burden, financial burden of raising a child. Those are all desirable. It is to say that nothing in the ancillary ends and those positive consequences would affect the grounds on which we judge the act. Okay? All right? So in a sense, right, we have this duty to follow moral principles and not to follow our instincts or any power outside of our control. We are autonomous. We are free to choose between right and wrong. And to determine the morality of an act, the idea in that act must be categorical, must be able to be applied to all people in all situations. Thanks for listening.